Great.
How are you guys? We are sharing a testimony of faith today, and I have Dan Cohen with me, and he'll tell us about his father's story. He's here today to share how this affected his faith and some other people around him as well. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm so glad you're here. I'll give you the floor, and you can tell us about your story today.
Thanks, and I appreciate the time. So we had a really remarkable family story, and with my father. My father had a stroke when he was 75 years old, and his stroke then led to dementia, which a lot of people are dealing with loved ones that have dementia. Very quickly, a lot of people know of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is one of the causes that leads to dementia. Dementia is the mental condition that is the symptom. So you can get dementia through Alzheimer's, which is plaque in the brain. You can get it from a blow to a head. Certain diseases can cause dementia. It can also happen through vascular dementia, which is a hardening of the arteries. And dementia is a loss of cognitive function. It runs in 7 stages on a downward trend, and it gets progressively worse. And I know a lot of your listeners are probably experiencing it with a loved one. And it's a difficult thing, and it does, in a sense, test your faith because you are. You're watching your loved one fade away. It's almost like you're mourning your loved one. But to me, what's very important is that you accept your loved one throughout all the stages because it's very easy to get frustrated with them. A person with dementia might ask the same questions over and over again. They might ask you to repeat things. And our natural tendency is to challenge someone. I already told you that. You asked me that a million times. Or they'll say, oh, my loved one or whoever was so much better 6 months ago. And because it gets progressively worse, so the first thing I say is you got to accept them for where you're at because it's not someone doing it rationally. It's a part of their brain that's screwed up. So if you can accept that and also accept yourself, give yourself some grace that you're not going to be perfect all the time. So my father was a very big presence in my life. He was my hero. He was my confidant. He was my go-to guy. I went through a divorce. He was the guy for me. He helped me in business. I wrote a book called Awakenings in Real Life, and I have a chapter called The One. Who's the one person in your life that wants you to succeed and has no ego when it comes to you? So he was that guy for me. So when he had a stroke, which led to dementia, it's very difficult to lose that presence when they're so important in your life. So he went through all the different stages. And I tell people that are going through it, you know your person better than anybody else. If you want to go to the doctor and find out if they're in stage 4 or 5 or 6, you can do it. To me, I didn't want to. Your family knows best what your person is going through. I didn't need the additional angst to know exactly what stage it was. But that's just one of my situations. So he went the gamut, okay, and he got the stroke in 2005. By 2015, he was in the very late stages. So we were fortunate in that he knew us most of the time. There are a lot of situations where people with Alzheimer's and dementias, they don't really recognize their loved ones. So he knew us most of the time. Sometimes he didn't. I think that would have been the most difficult. But he hardly spoke. He never initiated conversation. He would give one or two answers. He was incontinent. He wore a Depends. Your mental functions affects your physical functions. So he really wasn't walking. He was in a wheelchair. He needed help getting bathed and shaved. And we were also fortunate. A lot of times, people going through dementia, they become mean-spirited. He remained pretty amiable, which is good for my family. But when he would get shaved and bathed, he would cry out in pain. So it's very difficult to hear your parent cry out in pain when they're not in pain. So that was a difficult thing. So it's a difficult thing to go through. But if you do the acceptance and you accept the mid stages, the essence of who he was there was always there, the love he had, and that, was a wonderful thing because at the end he would hold my hand and kiss it. He was a very demonstratively loving man, but that was enough for me, holding my hand and kissing it. But we had a really tremendous experience in 2015. So he was hospitalized with pneumonia twice in 2015. Now, my brother is a doctor and his office takes care of him, right? So he went into the hospital. He was also hypertensive and they loaded him up with steroids and antibiotics. All right. He's in the hospital bed. Now, remember, at this point, I described the condition he was in. I walked in. He says, "Hi, Danny." And I said, "Hi, Dad." He says, "I love you very much." And I said, "I love you very much, Dad, too." He says, "What happened to me?" And I said, "Well, you have pneumonia, you're being treated, and you're going to go home soon." Then I said to myself, this is not the man I saw a few days ago. This resembles my father. And maybe he wasn't saying to me, what am I going through now? But maybe he was saying, what happened to me these past 10 years? So if I had to put it in percentages, I would say he was 90% the guy I remember. My brother, who was worked in the hospital too, said the bar was so low and he came back so high, he was having full conversations. So here's another interesting thing for your audience. I used to think that nobody on the planet had the relationship I did with my father. Now, I have an older brother and a younger sister, and I knew he loved my siblings, but I said, boy, my relationship's special. So we had a 75th birthday party for my father, and everybody from my mother to the youngest grandkids spoke to my father and shared their story. And I listened to my brother, and my brother and I have different personalities. And he goes, "I'm so much like my father." And I'm thinking, how could that be? I'm so much like my father. And he told stories, and I said, wow, he feels exactly the same way I do. And then my sister, there's a lot of men in the family, and she's one of the few females. She said, well, my friends all love my father. He's so warm. But can you imagine being Herbie's little girl? And then she sang him a song. So I said, he had the ability to make everybody feel special and loved. So my brother says that to have his father back, who was the most influential man in his life, what it did was it was one of the most seminal moments of his life. So we really had 2 days of some remarkable experiences. So one of the things is we started to fill him in on what the grandchildren are doing. And he said, that's great, that's wonderful. And then he says, isn't one of the grandsons started medical school and didn't another one start Ivy League school? And we said, you're right, Dad. And then we said to ourselves, wow, that happened while he was in the midst of dementia. How could he know that? Because we never really know what these people are going through. I was in a support group once, and someone said to me, isn't it great that a person with Alzheimer's and dementia is like they're in their own world and they're happy in their own world? No, you got to include them in life. That's the other thing. If you go out, include them, take them out to dinner where you can. I used to take my parents to a movie and dinner all the time. But the fact that he somehow knew about the two grandchildren in the schools tells me that he was more aware that was going on. So he reminisced about his favorite football player, and he was a boxer in the army, and he was undersized. He surprised his opponents. Remarkable. He told my mother that she was the love of his life. They were married 62 years. My father had some quirks. So he used to take a nap, right? And to block out any light in the room, he'd put a brown or black sock over his eyes. He's lying in the hospital, says to my mother, do you have my sock? I want to take a nap. Amazing. He, my father through life was a big tipper. If you took care of him, especially in the service business, sometimes he tipped people even if And it didn't matter the economic status. So once he says to my mother, "You have any cash?" She says, "What do you need cash for? You're in the hospital." I want to tip the nurses and aides. That was so wonderful for me. So I wanted to bring my kids there because they saw their grandfather as a grandfather when they were younger. So I got them there. It was after 2 days he had reverted back to dementia. But we videotaped some of it and we showed them this. My brother asked my father, "What are you happy about?" He said, "I'm just happy to be here and alive." That moment was so profound for me that I think he was telling the family that he's a fighter his whole life. Literally, he was a boxer in the army, and he's going to fight to live. And so what I did was I wrote an article about it. I put it on medium.com and I shared it. And then I discovered his message wasn't only for the family, but his message was really for the people going through this. It gave them hope that their loved ones going through it still appreciated and wanted to live life. So it was very profound. We were trying to figure out why this happened, and here's really where the faith part comes into it. My brother, the doctor, tried to find a medical explanation. First, he thought it was the steroids reducing inflammation in the brain. And I said, "How could that be? It's irreversible. How can anything reverse it?" He later on got rid of that theory and thought because he was getting better from the pneumonia, somehow it got better. Meanwhile, his neurologist never saw it. In 30 years of practice, my brother asked his colleagues, no one has ever seen it. People will have moments of recognition and moments of clarity, but not 2 full days, you know? And again, was he sending a message that's still a fighter? And then I said to myself, well, maybe it's a miracle. And I thought that was a good as explanation as anything else. Okay. And I'm not the most religious guy, but in my religion, I'm a spiritual guy and believe in the religion in that respect. But it really reawakened my faith. You know, I always believed in that there was a God, but now I think there was a reason that this happened. And I was at a book signing for my book, Awakenings in Real Life. And a friend of mine came up to me and says, "You know why I think this happened? I think your dad went through what he did, so you could write about it and share it with the world." And I think his message of hope, and I don't think it's only for people going through Alzheimer's or dementia. I think it's for people with other mental conditions, people with physical conditions and disabilities that they do want to live and they appreciate life. And you got to treat them that way. You got to, the other thing besides accepting them where it's at, include your loved one in life. It really is. I think that's the message. And if that's God's message to these people, to not lose hope. Okay. You can never lose hope no matter where the circumstances is. You should treat your person with dignity. Don't ignore them, even if you think they're not aware of what's going on, and include them in life as most would it does. So I'm an entrepreneur in my life, and I wanted to write a book about it, but I didn't think this story was enough. And I found an editor, and I said, I have other great family stories, but who wants to hear my family story? But when I reflected back on my family stories, I said, you know what? These stories are almost like mini awakenings, other lessons learned, and I can share that with the reader. So I have stories of acts of kindness, how my father used to like to go to the horse track, and there was always a valet there that no matter whether my father had a walker or a wheelchair, he'd take me out of the car. At a certain point, he'd drive us to the entrance back and forth. And he was losing tips, but just his act of kindness was so important to us. I had an uncle that showed up no matter where we were. He showed up to my father when he was in basic training. He just showed one up day at the gate. And we'd come home 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. He was there greeting us. The importance showing up for people. So I tell these stories in the book, and I also leave like reflection pages. So I want people to share their experience, how an act of kindness impacted them, how accepting their loved one, what they're going through, shared their lives. So That's what I did. I wrote a book about my dad's awakening, and I say my dad's awakening from dementia woke me up too. So I tell that story and other family stories. But that's not the end of my second career in life. I saw a story on TV about a man who went through a spinal condition. He had a spinal condition. He was in pain. He says, "You know what? I'm going to leave my corporate life. I'm going to learn how to sail, and I'm going to sail across the Pacific Ocean with my cat." His story became viral. It was all over the news, all over social media. And I said to myself, he had an awakening. And I bet you there's a lot of people out there that have awakenings. You know, we think of it typically religious and spiritual awakenings, and I have those kind of stories. But an awakening can be a realization, an awareness, or recognition of something. So I have a guy who was a skydiver and jumped out of a plane and his neck broke, and he had a near-death experience. I have people that went through trauma, and their awakening moment is how they came past their trauma through their faith to help coach other people. I had a guy who was bullied his whole life, and later in life, 46 years old, he decides to become a humanitarian clown to spread joy. So he went from trying to be as invisible as possible as a person being bullied to as visible as possible. A man whose son who had autism, and his awakening moment was the time they really first connected. So I share all these different stories of awakenings. And my father's experience, it awakened my faith and my desire to share these stories, my father's story of hope, but other people's stories of hope, because their stories help other people in similar circumstances. So that's what I've gone through.
Thank you for sharing your story, your experience, right? Your father's experience and how your family realized how meaningful that was, right? For you and for
Yeah.
others, because it does make a difference in the world what you're doing. And I want to ask you, I know you mentioned that this reframed a few things for you, right? It reframed the way that you looked at mental illness and also people who are
Right.
going through dementia and other
Right.
circumstances. But I really want to ask you, how did you change your view on spirituality based on this? Because although we see mental deficits, we see a lot of emotional deficits in some people, we realize that their spirit it's somehow separate from these experiences, right? And I
You
really want to know what your opinion is because you pointed out that you still kept that spirit alive in your father by going out with him, creating those intimate moments, right? So what's your thought on that?
And you're exactly right. And I have a chapter in a book about that. I have a chapter that says, dementia cured my father's OCD. My father suffered from OCD his whole life, which is obsessive thoughts. Then, when he got the stroke and dementia, OCD went away. But you're right, because the spiritual part of it is it allowed me, and I think it's important, to separate the person's spirit from their illness or disease. Absolutely right. Because we too often in society think of the person as the disease or as the illness. And that's so not fair. If you reframe it, right, as the person's spirit, right, that this is just a part of the brain that's grew up, that it's the person who has an illness and not the illness itself. What I would think is we can get rid of so much stigma, especially with mental disease. You know, you find it less so with cancer, someone has cancer, but a mental disease already people are written off. But no, it's no different. You got to treat it the same way, but you got to separate the person's spirit and the person's belief from the illness because that's not them. That's a part of the brain isn't working. They're in there. In fact, before I wrote this book, I wrote an article that said, I wish I could flip a switch and wake up my dad. I know my dad's in there. I felt he was there. I knew his spirit was there. I never lost that spirit. And it turns out that he had this awakening, which proved to me that he was there. So my brother, right? He checked on every doctor order, and then my father was in the hospital too. Let me tell you something. There were times when my brother said, "I don't think he's gonna. His organs are failing. Make it in the morning." Miraculously, literally, 3 or 4 times he came back to life. His spirit was so alive. So another doctor me says, "What are you guys doing? This is not the Herbie we remember. The gregarious, full of person." Man, and I said, first of all, nobody has a right to tell us, you know, we want him in our lives as long as he said. Like I said before, just him holding and kissing my hand was his spirit was there. It really was. And I think you can never underestimate the human spirit and the human because, they say people in comas, right? To talk to people in comas. And then you hear stories about people coming out of the coma and repeating things they heard or knowing things because the human spirit, so it's reawakened my belief in the human spirit and the faith in the human being. And we are capable of really incredible things, and don't discount your loved one because they're going through something difficult. The best thing you could do for yourself and them is treat them with dignity and grace and love. So that was a great
Yes.
question.
So I do believe that sometimes we do have to separate the person, like you said, from the spirit. And also everything is not explainable through science, right? We don't have an answer for everything. So we have to
No.
remain positive and use those awakening moments, right, to become more accepting of just people, our experiences in life. And I know that you wrote your book, but I wonder if we also
Yes.
have any other information from you that we can support you by.
Sure. Thank you. So it's called Awakenings in Life by Dan Cohen, right? You could find it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, other.coms. It's also in select bookstores. You could also come to my website. I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm a branding guy. So my website is awakeningsinreallife.com. There's a link to find the book. Also on my website, if you're interested in some of my podcast episodes. So I have an episode. Here's an interesting one. You'd like this one. So this woman's father died in 2015. She was an atheist, okay? Her awakening moment was to prove that there's life after death, that the spirit lives on. So she's done tremendous. I had her on as a guest. Okay. She's done a tremendous amount of research to show that she calls it the consciousness, but you could call it the spirit, that the spirit lives on. So someone not believing became a really believing. And that was quite an interesting story. But you could find my podcast is on YouTube, Awakenings in Your Life, Apple, Spotify, but there's also links on my website. If you've gone through an awakening moment, you can, I welcome hearing from people. My email is info@awakenings in real life. If you want to get the book and you want to share some of your reflections, I'll put that on. The reason I want people to reflect, I want them to be a part of my journey as well. I'll share that on the website. I'm on all social media again, Awakenings in Real Life. So I'm not too difficult to find if you look, and it's Dan Cohen. So that's where
All
you
right.
find me.
Thank you so much for your time, your story, and the decision you made to help other people awaken and learn from your experience. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
No
Thanks
problem.
so much.